What we've seen within the talks is that agriculture in general, but particularly livestock, is not part of the wider agenda. And this is a clear omission given the extent to which the livestock sector contributes to global greenhouse gases at around 15%. And I think the reasons for this are numerous, but I think primarily it's because, as I mentioned, agriculture isn't given the attention it deserves, but meat consumption is seen as particularly culturally sensitive. And so trying to address diets is seen as something that national governments are slightly reluctant to do.
Okay. And to what degree is there a concern about the developing world and increasing consumptions of meat levels and perhaps an aspiration to have more of a Western-based diet?
If you look at the projections going forward, then by around 2050, there'll be an increase of around 76% of 70% increase in meat consumption. A lot of this is seen in emerging economies and to some extent within developing countries. But what we know is that they are moving towards a level of consumption that is unsustainable both from an environmental perspective but also from a health perspective. So in industrialized countries like the United States, like the EU, like Australasia, they consume per head of population significantly higher than that recommended from a health perspective.
Now, I think over 180 countries have now submitted so-called intended nationally determined contributions to a Paris deal. From my viewing, these are heavily focused in the energy sector. There's a bit of a discussion of the land sector, but does this even figure in the majority of these INDCs? And is this a good place to look for further emissions cuts as we remain off track to cap global warming to 2 degrees?
Yeah. So we did an analysis of the INDCs as of the early October. And what we saw of the 120 that we looked at, around 20 mentioned livestock, and only one, China, had any mention at all about issues around efficiency within the sort of consumption side of food. So it's a clear area that the proposed emissions cuts are missing. And I think this is really important because, as you mentioned, what we know is that of all the pledges made, we don't meet the 2-degree target. And what we hope is that post-Paris there will be a number of discussions about how to increase the ambitions from the existing pledges. And I think importantly, many of the countries will have been through certain sectors and said, well, we know what we're going to get in terms of the power sector, we know what we get from the transport sector. And in some ways opening up discussions in new sectors may be politically easier than revisiting the existing pledges. So we're very optimistic that this is a real area in which both nationally and internationally we can see changes.
All industries tend to have large vested interests, but is the meat and the dairy and the agricultural lobby particularly strong?
As you said, all incumbents, they have existing business models, they have existing supply chains, and change isn't really, and in particular transformative change, isn't really what they're wanting to do. So yes, we do know that the agriculture and the livestock sector have lobbies that don't necessarily want to change, but we also know that it's going to have to change. We know that globally obesity is, according to McKinsey, the third largest contributor of financial. We know from McKinsey that obesity is the third largest of all human-induced impacts on society. So reducing overconsumption in the food sector as a whole, and in particular livestock, brings huge economic advantages.
Antony Froggatt, thanks very much. We'll leave it there.
Thank you.